Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Niels Tjonk. I am a program maker at Studium Generale Utrecht University. Before we start, some practicalities. You are watching this in the evening, but we are filming this in the morning because of the curfew. You will first be watching this lecture by Dr Genner Llanes Ortiz called Why Indigenous Earth Defenders Are Being Silenced. After these approximately 45 minutes, we will fly in a live stream where we will go deeper into conversation with Hener. This second part will be live. You do not need to switch channels. You just have to keep watching after the lecture and we'll pop up. You are an important player in this second part. Some of you already sent in some questions. Thank you for that. If you think of any questions now for Hener, please do ask them. The YouTube live chat to my left is to that purpose. But first, let me introduce you the speaker of this evening, Dr. Genner Llanes Ortiz. Hener is assistant professor in heritage of indigenous peoples and archaeology at Leiden University. In his own words, he is a Maya anthropologist. A close personal connection to the Yucatec Maya in Mexico, as well as many collaborative research projects with indigenous communities of other descents have made Hener an expert of the indigenous peoples of South and Central America. With this expertise comes also the difficult knowledge of the hardship that many indigenous communities have to endure. Many live on lands much sought after by international corporations for their mineable resources, such as gold and oil. For the people who live with these lands, becoming an environmental defender is sometimes the only logical response. But to raise your voice for the environment there means to fear for your safety. As documented by the NGO Global Witness, the Earth witnesses more than 80 murders on indigenous environmental defenders each year. That's more than one person every week. How could the system have gone awry so bleakly, and what should happen to better protect those who protect our Earth? I give the stage to Hener.
Thank you, Niels. Goedendag. Welcome to this session and to this talk, which I hope will be of interest to you. As Niels said, my name is Genner Llanes Ortiz. I come from the Yucatec Maya people, and I've been a professor at Leiden University for the last 5 years, where I teach heritage of indigenous peoples, among many other topics. I'm a member of the board of the Center for Indigenous America Studies, and this talk is in the framework of the work that we do, trying to document and protect and preserve diversity for the world. So my talk is why are indigenous earth defenders being silenced? Let me just say before I start that I do not pretend to be speaking on behalf of indigenous earth defenders, but I'm speaking for them. I'm speaking to make their situation and their challenges known to other people, and also to try to unpack the reasons why they have become such a clear target for all of crimes that are committed against environmental earth defenders. I'm going to start with sorry, this is me not knowing how to use this. So you press this arrow. Okay. So, and you can probably cut this on edition. I'm going to start by talking about two individual indigenous earth defenders. The first one is this woman over here. Her name is Berta Cáceres, and she's a Lenca defender. She belonged to the Lenca people of Honduras, where she was murdered on the 2nd of March of 2016. Berta Cáceres was working along with her organization, and they were collectively trying to defend the integrity of the river, one of the main rivers on which the lives of several Lenca communities depend, against the construction of a hydroelectric dam. There were lots of interest involved in the construction of this dam, and on the 2nd of March of 2016, group of people barged into the house of Berta and killed her on the spot. In 2018, it was found out by the Honduran police and law enforcement people that 7 material authors were the culprits for these crimes, and they have since been indicted. But the movement to reclaim justice for Berta is still very much ongoing, because the intellectual authors of this crime are still very much at large. Berta left behind 3 beautiful daughters, one of whom was with us here in the Netherlands in 2016 during a colloquium that we organized at Leiden University. And she spoke to several people, activists also in the Netherlands, about this crime and about the situation that Lenca communities were facing in the context of these struggles. Laura Zúñiga Cáceres, that's the name of Berta's daughter, she was particularly interested in talking to the directors of FMO, which is the Development Bank of the Netherlands, because they had an investment promise into this project, into this hydroelectric dam. The project was called Aguasarca, and since then FMO retreated its support, and the project is in standby. But the main directors, people who are directly involved in the running of this project, as well as in indirectly, or to the extent that we know, related to the crime that was committed, they are still very much at large. And although they have been detained, the clocks of the legal machinery in Honduras move very, very slowly. The other indigenous ad defender that I wanted to talk about is this man over here. His name is Samir Flores, and he's a Nahua defender. He's from Mexico, and he was murdered barely 12 steps outside of his home in Morelos, Central State in Mexico, because he was opposed to the construction of a hydroelectric dam again, but along with many other development projects. There was a pipeline that was going to go through his community, and there's also an aqueduct and many other works that were promised that threaten the lives and the environmental integrity in the region where he lives, in Morelos, the state of Morelos. It's been 2 years since Samir was assassinated, and he was assassinated after the promise that the project was going to stop by the president of Mexico, the current president of Mexico, who since then went back on his promise, and he has tried to push forward what they call the integral project for the development of Morelos. So the crime is still very much unpunished. There has been a lot of investigations about who could be charged with this crime. And in the political circles in Mexico, what he said is that the authorities already know who the material author is, but they are afraid to act because that could put in peril, in jeopardy, the whole edifice of the development project that they are trying to promote in this region. So these 2 lives are representative of the many dozens of lives of indigenous as well as non-indigenous environmental defenders, the ones that organizations like Amnesty International call earth defenders. And this talk is an attempt to sort of try to unpick, try to unravel, and to discover a little bit more about the lives of these people and the sort of struggles that they're facing. Okay, so let us move to this chart. So this is a chart produced as part of a report by the international organization Global Witness. The report is called Enemies of the State, and it was published for the first time in 2019. Now, this is a table that reflects the number of deaths that happened during 2018 alone, right? So we're looking here at 30 people murdered in the Philippines, 24 in Colombia, 23 in India, 20 in Brazil, 16 in Guatemala, and 14 in Mexico, and then come a list of other countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iran, Honduras, Ukraine, Venezuela, Cambodia, Kenya, Gambia, Chile, Pakistan, Senegal, South Africa, and Indonesia. So as you can see, the larger number of killings of environmental defenders happens in two main regions. On the one hand, the Southeast Asia and East Asia, and on the other hand, Latin America. And Latin America is represented by three countries mostly: Colombia, Brazil, Guatemala, and also Mexico. So when we look closer to these numbers, we notice that the number of killings are related to certain industries and are associated one way or another with what happens in terms of how development projects are implemented in these countries, in these regions, and suspicions about possible links between the ways in which international companies and corporations, in alliance with governments, create a hostile environment that leads to the killings of these activists. So mining is one of the main culprits when it comes to assassinations of indigenous and non-indigenous environmental defenders. And then come agrobusiness, water and dams, as in the case of Berta and Samir, but also logging, poaching, especially in Africa, fishing in places like Canada and Japan and the North Atlantic, and then come wind power and others. And we have also a number of crimes that do not have a clear link with any sector in particular, but are framed within the broader context of government investment and other developments. The focus on indigenous air defenders comes from the fact that although they are not the only people, the only population that is targeted by these killings, they do represent a disproportionate amount of defenders attacked and killed in relation to the work that they do as human rights activists. So let us have a look at my home country. Laura Castellanos, who is a journalist, published in 2019 an analysis that she did, cross-referencing global witness reports with other reports by other environmental organizations as well as political organizations in Mexico. And she discovered that in the previous decade, 125 crimes had been committed against environmental defenders in Mexico. 82 of these crimes were against indigenous peoples, which represents 66% of the total crimes committed against environmental activists. What is quite shocking is that when we consider the percentage of the population in Mexico that is identified as indigenous, this is barely 6.1% of the total population in the country. That means that an indigenous air defender is 10 times more likely to be attacked and killed because of the human rights work that he or she does in relation to the protection of nature, the environment, forests, rivers, mountains, and so on. And this is not exclusive of Mexico. This is particularly shocking when it comes to Mexico, not surprising for the people like me who know what is the situation of discrimination and injustice that prevails in my home country. But it also relates to other numbers, right? In the Philippines, also an important percentage of indigenous peoples from the Philippines have been murdered as a result of the work that they do, as well as in Colombia. And I was talking to an activist who actually lives here in the Netherlands, who was telling me that out of the number of people who have been killed in the last 5 or 2 years in Colombia, 44% of those defenders have been indigenous, so people who live in the countryside or who are directly affiliated to an indigenous people, an indigenous nation in Colombia. This is in a country where barely 1% of the population is indigenous. So here we are talking, of an even larger index of people who have been murdered as the result of their work. So this is the main point that I wanted to bring here. And the question about why is it that they are attacked, we'll try to respond in the remaining of this talk. Let us just say for now that killing is merely it's only the most extreme form of attack that indigenous and non-indigenous environmental defenders suffer in the line of work. There's also often many other forms of violence that are associated, like threats against them directly or members of the family, intimidation, sometimes through digital media as well as directly. There's surveillance that they are subjected to by either non-identified agents as well as by governmental agents, and among many, many other aspects. There's also the criminalization as a strategy that both governments and corporations use to intimidate indigenous defenders. And what is this criminalization? It means that their activities are generally targeted, and legal reforms are introduced to make them less possible, to punish them in a much harsher way. Only this year, at the beginning of this year, in countries like the United States, state legislatures, congresses in 4 states where a pipeline has been planned to be constructed in the last 5 years, have started pushing for a toughening of penalties against people who dare to even protest against these pipelines. That means that people who are detained, and in previous years we have all seen on TV all of these images from the marches and demonstrations that happened, especially in 2016 and also in 2017, at the beginning of 2017, against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in northern United States. Opposition against the construction of pipelines is still very much ongoing. And what the state governments of Minnesota, Montana, Arkansas, and Kansas want to do is to make it more difficult for people to protest, make it more less likely for people to engage in these kind of demonstrations, and to punish more harsher those who dare to protest, to dare to speak against the construction of these pipelines. So this is the sort of criminalization that defenders often encounter. That doesn't necessarily end in the killing of the activists, but that is nonetheless also threatening of their lives. In a cruel irony, what happens often, as the cases of Berta and Samir illustrate, is that the material perpetrators of these crimes often escape justice. The cogs of the legal machinery in the countries where we live are corrupted. So a long time passes until the actual perpetrators are caught, and generally they are left free, right? On the other hand, when environmental defenders are caught and they are charged with misdemeanors committed during protests, they end up becoming political prisoners, as is the case of a prominent Maya activist in Guatemala. Right. So why is it that this happened? And here I'm gonna take you a little bit further back into colonial times, because I think that there's some truth about the way in which indigenous and other rural people, especially in parts of Latin America, North America, Southeast Asia, and Asia, are seen, are still perceived. So this goes back to the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. In the 16th century, as European powers started to expand their dominion over the planet, they were regulated, self-regulated by a law that originated in Roman times. And that law mandated that only the land that was unoccupied could be claimed by any power, the crown, the companies, trade companies, and so on, only could claim those lands that were unoccupied. That is terra nullius or no man's land, right? But because the majority of the world was actually occupied, and this is true for the Americas as well, for any other region that was conquered in the world, the European traditional doctrine couldn't be applied, rationally or consciously by European powers. So what they found is that what they started to create was a new sort of doctrine where terra nullius started to be translated as those lands that, yes, had people occupying them, but people who weren't treating those lands in a proper civilized way, which meant in a European way, right? So many of those lands were considered to be uncultivated because, they were occupied by societies that were for the most part nomadic, or, only occupied these lands seasonally, for a very short period of time, and then they will move to another part. So this was construed, this was represented, understood as uncivilized, and therefore allowed European powers to remove these people from the land in order to occupy it and give it a proper civilized use, right? Unsurprisingly, this in itself denied the very humanity of indigenous populations. And in Latin America, the conversations of Salamanca are generally used as a point of reference. Debates that happen, the debate of Valladolid as well, where two scholars, two theologians, engage in a debate to try to establish if indigenous peoples of the Americas even had a soul, were humans at all, right? Eventually, they decided that yes, in fact, indigenous populations had a soul, were humans, but that they needed to be protected by the crown and being brought into some sort of patronage by the conquistadors in Latin America. But this only goes to show you that many of these ideas about the lack of humanity, about the lack of civilization that indigenous peoples have in the eyes of this doctrine continue to be present in one way or another. In the Americas, again, going back to Brazil, where we had, the Brazilians have today a president who is very openly anti-indigenous and who often expresses himself in a very racist way against indigenous populations. Last year, he declared, among other things, that yes, indigenous peoples in Brazil, they were starting to look more like us humans, right? So, they have started changing in the eyes of Jair Bolsonaro because they were starting to become more like humans. That those were the words that he used as part of his declarations. But the terra nullius is not only sort of present in the discourses of these very awful politicians that we have in the Americas. It's also noticeable in ways of, for instance, representing, understanding the land. So what we see here is an example of how often indigenous lands continue to be represented as empty, right? So this is an example from a very interesting website, which is called digitaldemocracy.org, where they have been working, with several technologies to sort of try and map out indigenous lands to support the struggles of indigenous peoples. So what we see here, and let's just get closer. So these are the ancestral lands of the Waorani people of Ecuador, right? So you see the map here. Well, this is a very objective map. It's an image that's been taken from a satellite, and it shows number of villages in that plot of land, and in between we see nothing, right? So this empty space. We're going to try to pay attention particularly to this village here, which is called Nemopare. And this is the sort of work that this is the sort of image that will emerge if you were to consider the culture and the practices of indigenous peoples in the land. So we see here, again, the village, Nemopare, and we see that empty space covered with different signs that indicate a number of activities and the presence of different resources that the Waorani people identify in their land. So on a second look, this land is anything but empty. This land is full of presences, it's full of resources that are managed, biodiversity that benefit the lives of the Waorani people, but that in recent years also have become of importance for the planet as a whole, for our whole species. And we see here that in the effort to map out these resources, you fill in the space so that you move from a no man's land to a fully occupied space that is made the more richer by indigenous people's livelihoods. So the director of this NGO, Digital Democracy, Emily Jacobi, she writes in a very interesting blog that terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery both seem to be a thing of the past. But in fact, what we notice when we look at the way in which governments and corporations often represent the lands that they are trying to develop is that these ideas are very much are still in place, although rather than calling these lands uncivilized, now the preferred concept to use is lands undeveloped. This is also reflected in how in the 1970s, 1960s, how different governments in the world, different international agencies also looked at indigenous peoples and other less developed, less rich nations in the world, right? So we were coming out of the Second World War, and there was a lot of hunger and poverty. Also was the time of decolonization, and several nations in the world wanted to catch up with the West. And then that was the time when the so-called Green Revolution started to be introduced in different parts of the world. What happened during those years is that indigenous livelihoods started to be represented as backwards because they didn't follow the instrumental logic of profit production and the mechanistic logic of a lot of this industrial agriculture that started to be introduced in different parts of the world. In Mexico, for instance, this meant displacing a lot of traditional crops and traditional knowledge that indigenous peoples had at the time, and that since then became marginalized, and many of these forms of knowledge are in danger of disappearing. Ironically, today, when we are facing the challenge of planetary destruction because of the loss of biodiversity and climate change and many other perils that we're facing as a humanity, now a lot of people are turning their gaze back to the practices of indigenous peoples. Practices that are based on the maintenance of biodiversity, the growth of biodiversity, and the management of biodiversity. In Western context, you often hear the expression that indigenous peoples tend to live in harmony with their environment, which is only partially true. Because in fact, what happens is that there's a lot of intervention that indigenous societies do in the landscape. And those interventions are aimed to protect the fragility of the environment, because after centuries of coexistence with that environment, a lot of indigenous societies know intimately how fragile those ecosystems are. And the only way in which they have been able to maintain that fragility is by managing a very sophisticated form of biodiversity growth that responds to different selection of different parts, but also very harsh forms of intervention, including what is called in some contexts cultural burning, right? So that means that is the partial destruction of plots of forest in order to prevent a greater destruction brought about by accidents or wildfires and many other forms. This management is very complex and is constantly changing and is constantly transforming, but it responds to the principle of biodiversity protection and maintenance. And this is what we see here. So instead of a monoculture, the cornfields in different parts of the Americas, especially in Mexico, often bring together different types of harvest: beans, squash, along with corn, fruits, chilies. All of them coexist in the cornfield, unlike all of those plots of land where you only have one crop, monocultural agriculture. This allows the growth of delicatessen foods like fungi that are very tasty, that is an acquired taste. We see that in the middle is one of my favorite foods that is called cuitlacoche, and it's a mushroom that grows in the corn, and that wouldn't grow in an industrial agricultural plot, because everything is covered with pesticides and so on. And that also has allowed the maintenance of different varieties of corn, one of the most important crops in the world today. You see here corn of different colors: red, black, white, and yellow. And these are only a handful of the more than 200, even 500 different varieties of corn that exist in indigenous societies in the Americas. So this is the irony today, that after having been targeted for being backwards, for being uncivilized, for being primitive societies, today the world is starting to wake up to the fact that indigenous societies, indigenous peoples in the world manage almost a quarter of the land mass in the whole planet. So this is a map that was created and published in a recent article in the Nature journal. So all of these areas in purple indicate indigenous managed lands according to official records. So this could be either larger or smaller, but just based on those lands that could be verified and that officially are considered indigenous, managed in those countries, is that this map has been created. So you can see that almost the entire land mass of the Americas is managed by indigenous societies, as well as Western Africa, a big portion of Asia, and Siberia, Greenland, and as well as the continent of Australia, right? And there are various degrees, so we see here at the bottom. But this map was created in the context of trying to understand, as a project, what is the global importance of indigenous managed lands for conservation. And one of the main findings of this exercise, which is, of course, perfectible, and there are already people who are saying, a lot of data was not taken into consideration and so on. But one of the main findings that was made through this article is that 25% of the land in the planet is managed by indigenous peoples or indigenous societies. But this percentage is even larger when we consider only those areas that have been marked as biodiversity hotspots. And when we consider only those lands that are biodiverse, that are hyper diverse, then 40% of those lands are managed by indigenous peoples. So this means that culturally, politically, indigenous peoples are at the center of efforts to protect biodiversity, protect lands, protect the environment, and so on. But why is that? Is this anything to do with this harmony idea that a lot of people in the West has? Yes, to some extent, and as I said, this is partially true. But it's also deeply ingrained in the cosmologies that indigenous peoples have been able to maintain in spite of colonization. And when I say cosmology, you could think religion, you can think spirituality, you can think philosophy. All of those things come together in the idea of cosmology, because those differences didn't exist before colonization, and for the most part, they are still very much fluid, right? So we talk about philosophy, we talk about spirituality, we talk about religion in the same way as we talk about agriculture and other very practical activities. So indigenous peoples have a very peculiar way, a very specific way of relating with the environment, be it the glaciers in North America or the rainforests of the equatorial lands in the world. And what we see here is a landscape that is not empty, that is not completely different to the life of humans, but that are actually part of our community. So the landscape, features in the landscape, glaciers, rivers, forests, mountains are considered part of the histories that we inhabit, and they are also records of our existence in the land, right? So for instance, in 2016, this made the news in an international publication, The Guardian, because this forest in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, was for the first time, it entered for the first time the legal system of Aotearoa New Zealand as a legal person. So this is the forest that is known as Te Urewera, and which is managed by the Tuho nation. So this is like a tribal division within the Maori people, who, after years of struggle, finally managed to make protection of this forest into law. And what it means here, that this landscape is a person, is that in many legal systems in the world, you can only protest the destruction of the environment if you have a direct stake in that environment, right? So if you can prove that you are damaged as an individual or as a collective, is that you can actually demand that tougher environmental protections come into place to protect a river, a piece of land, a forest, etc. What this change that came into power in 2014 actually means is that the forest itself is a person that deserves protection. So that in fact translates an important principle of Maori cosmology, which recognizes that the forest and many other elements in the landscape are ancestral companions of the tribe, or as it's called in New Zealand, the iwi, and that this company deserves a correspondence, a reciprocity, that the forest protect us as well as we protect the forest, because the forest is the place where the ancestors live, and is in fact an ancestral person, right? So this means that changes like this are starting to happen more and more. This took place in 2014, but before that, in Latin America, Ecuador passed a law. Actually, the constitution of Ecuador was reformed in 2008. For the first time, recognized the rights of nature. So those were enshrined also in the constitution in Ecuador. And the year after, under the government of Evo Morales, one of the first presidents, indigenous presidents in Latin America, the Bolivian constitution also incorporated an acknowledgement of the rights of Pachamama, as Mother Earth is known in the Andean cultures. But this is not only part of an environmental conscious people, because we, as I explained, most indigenous societies do not see the forest as merely nature, but this is also a legacy. This is the heritage of our children, like this young Maori woman in the picture, and it's also, as I said, the principles that we uphold tell us that these are living beings with whom we actually share the planet, right? All of these ideas have eventually started to become recognized by scientists as well as by international policymakers. So these are only two examples that some of these principles, these cosmological notions that we have maintained in different indigenous societies have started to also show a little bit of the edge that they have in understanding our planet. So now we know, for instance, that forests are actually able to communicate, that trees talk to each other, and this is no fantasy. Forest scientists, especially in areas like Canada and other parts of the world, have been able to trace back the conversations that trees have through different enzymes and proteins and pollen and other forms that give us an indication that they are constantly exchanging information. But not only that, older trees take under their protection younger saplings, and they see that they are able to collect all of that information in order to grow healthy and be able to reach their potential. More recently, another scientist in Australia started to think that this very curious practice that a lot of indigenous peoples have of talking to nature, talking to the forest, or talking to plants, could be an indication of something else. And she started doing this experiment where she started growing in a greenhouse. They started growing a series of plants while at the same time playing a tape with the sound of a river. So this was only the tape that was playing, and it was only the sound that was in the environment. There was no humidity. There was no other material way in which plants could perhaps find out about this recording. And what she found out is that plants in that context will grow their roots in the direction of the recording. So that means that plants are able to sense sounds that could help them identify sources of water, potentially. Of course, this is science, so more research, more experiments are necessary to go into that. But with this, there are many other principles, there are many other practices that, as I said before, although originally dismissed as barbaric or primitive or superstitious, are now being understood as complex ways of relating to the environment that are based on cosmological principles, philosophical, spiritual, perhaps for many, but they are not different to other ideas that people manage in the world. So if you are interested, some of those links will be available in the YouTube recording. So when facing lots of these challenges, going back to the environmental defense, it will seem that indigenous rights or indigenous people's ways of lives are in the way of development. And this is very clear when it comes to mining, logging, and dams. But there's another more worrying aspect, that it also comes with so-called green energies or renewable sources of energy. Because what we find now is that wind farming and solar farming, while being a promise for the survival of our planet, in the way they are implemented, they are also acting on the same idea of terra nullius, right? So that what this represents is another form of monoculture. Instead of having diverse, complex rainforests, often what happens in regions that are underdeveloped in the Americas is that people are tricked into selling their lands or renting their lands for the establishment of these mega development projects. And this is true in Mexico, especially in southern Mexico and my home region of Yucatan, where there are different struggles currently in place to protest against the displacement of indigenous communities for the benefit of, yes, on the one hand, of the planet, preventing climate change and, sort of reducing the emission of particles that are warming our atmosphere. But on the other hand, they're also destroying ways of life of people. All of this has been recognized by different international agencies that work together with environmental defenders and have been enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was passed in 2007, right? And this is one of the most comprehensive charters that has been produced. Is the result of almost a decade of work and discussions with different governments. At the time of its passing, 4 governments in the world opposed the declaration, and those governments were the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Since then, since 2007, they have eventually come to accept some of the basic principles of this declaration, but there's still a long way to go. As you can see, the declaration is very comprehensive. It includes economic and social development rights, use of lands, territories and resources, traditional medicines, education, media and information, cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, as well as special protections for key sectors within indigenous communities themselves, women, the elderly, and young people. For more information, you can always check. I'll leave the link also in the YouTube channel. But one of the main, the thorniest issues of the declaration has to do with this article, which is Article 32.2 of the United Nations Declaration, which enshrines the rights that all indigenous peoples have to be consulted whenever a project is to be developed in their lands. And the consultations have to be prior to the approval of any project, have to be free, and have to be according to indigenous people's own institutions of consultation, of discussion, and debate. This is the thorniest issues, the most difficult to adhere by governments, and this is the matter of much debate, because we're talking about indigenous societies that exist in approximately 90 different countries, which speak more than 2,000 languages, and they have completely different histories, and they have their own institutions that have been transformed to different forms of colonization, and to be able to create a space that is free, where debates can happen, takes a lot of time and a lot of struggle. And this is one of the main sources of attacks that indigenous earth defenders have been suffering in the last 20 years. Because on the one hand, there's this international treaty, there's international framework that protects their rights to be consulted, and on the other hand, there's a lot of resistance, and it's still this doctrine that they don't have institutions, they don't have property rights, they don't have a proper way of using the land, and a lot of resistance on the part of governments and other, especially international corporations. So the translation of this quite logical right, quite clearly defined by history and by present culture's normative, is still a very thorny issue and a matter of much contention in the world today. So to finish with this talk, what can we do then, from the Netherlands, in different universities, from outside all of these indigenous and non-indigenous contexts where environmental defenders are trying to protect biodiversity and nature for the entire planet? Well, for me, one of the first things that people can do is to learn more about indigenous rights, how complex they are to implement, what are the resistance that they face by different actors internationally and regionally, and to make an informed decision to support those rights based on knowledge. To get to know and to amplify the stories of indigenous as well as non-indigenous earth defenders in places like, even in places like Latin America, a lot of the earth defenders do not belong to indigenous societies, but they are descendants of African people who were enslaved and brought to the Americas, and they are also facing the same challenges and the same threats that indigenous peoples suffer. Investigate, get to know more about what they're facing, and amplify their stories. Another important action that could be done is acknowledging that indigenous peoples do not inhabit the Netherlands. Doesn't mean that you are not separated from these situations. There are very strong links, as in the case of Berta Cáceres that I mentioned at the beginning. Often international bank systems are in place and supporting many of these projects that are said to damage the lands and the lives of indigenous as well as non-indigenous communities in the Americas. So find out who those companies are, what are the stakes in those projects, and what is the role that your government can take into making sure that they respect the human rights and environmental protections that are in place, both nationally and internationally. Also, as an individual, you could try to understand how your consumption choices impact all of these processes. A lot of the minerals that are um, uh, desperately sought after in indigenous lands are minerals that will end up in your hands directly or in the things that you wear, in the form of mobile phones or jeans, right? Even in the things that you apply to your face or to your hair, such as palm oil, which is a main driving force for deforestation and displacement of indigenous peoples, especially in Indonesia, the Philippines, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Batteries have a longer life in our context because of the lithium that is extracted in different parts and different regions of the Americas. So, find out and make conscious choices to be a responsible consumer. You don't have to change your mobile phone every time there's a new ad on your TV. Decide for yourself and be responsible. This will lead us to be linked in a better way and to together being better global citizens of this world. So with this, I finish this talk. We will make these links available for you to find out these sources of information that illustrate many of the points that I tried to make during this talk. And if you want to engage with organizations, we also have this list of international, national, and human rights networks that protect the lives and the work of environmental defenders all over the world. Thank you very much for an invitation, and I hope to talk to you and respond to your questions in our live session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hener. Thanks for this very clear and very inspiring talk. We'll continue in just a few seconds, so stick around. If you have any questions, write them down in the YouTube chat. Like I said, wait for a couple of seconds. We'll be back. We'll just fly in. You can stay in the same channel. See you then. Hi. All right. Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Thanks for watching. I'm here live with Hener now. Thanks also, Hener, for joining us this evening. You sent us a lot of questions, and we're going to try to cover them all. We have about 30 minutes for that. Well, people also sent in some questions, and you can still ask the questions that you want to ask. You can just post them in our live chat. But I want to start with a question first myself. In your presentation, you mentioned, you stated as such that certain hostile environments are created that lead to the killing of the indigenous and the non-indigenous activists. And I'm wondering, that sounds like it's a complex problem where there are many stakeholders involved. And you also mentioned material perpetrators, which also means that there are people that are deciding, that are making decisions that also lead to eventually the killing or the threatening of these activists. Can you tell me a bit more about these, what I now call immaterial perpetrators, and what kind of why they do what they do? It's a broad question, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
No, that's a perfectly valid question, and I think that is actually quite interesting as well. This probably leads us to sort of establish the network of interest that sometimes human rights defenders, in this case environmental defenders, touch, that create a hostile environment for them to continue working. And what you call immaterial perpetrators, or they're also called in some legal jargon intellectual authors of some of these attacks and crimes. You can trace them back by, quite easily. Sometimes the actual perpetrators pointing fingers at people who contacted them, and with the explicit aim to silence some of these defenders, and then you sort of establish the chain of connections leading all the way to people who are in high positions of power, and sometimes their interests are directly affected by the activities that these environmental defenders do. There are also sometimes when openly governments and corporations manifest their hostility towards these defenders, and there have even been cases when it's the security workers in places like mines or dams or any of these development projects. They are the ones who actually commit the crime. So they are easily identifiable and even more easy to establish who pay for the work that they do. I mean, it's not that they are sent an invoice for the crimes that they commit, but you can see the links, and often those go even far beyond. So when talking about, for instance, the case of Berta Cáceres, who is one of the earth defenders of whom I speak at the beginning of my talk. In 2018, there was an international group of experts, lawyers, researchers, and many other people who came together to look at the evidence. They went through all the judicial documentation, what has been presented in court, declarations, memos, and a long series of documents, and they were able to establish not only the direct responsibilities of people, the ones with the guns in their hands, but also the indirect responsibilities of corporations, directive boards, who didn't do enough with the tools that they had at their disposition to prevent the tragic consequences that we all know right now, and these go to banks, they go to investment funds, and many other actors, collective and corporative as well.
Mm-hmm. And is there enough power in the hands of the people who prosecute them to also give them a sentence? They find that maybe these board members are accountable to some of these actions. Does this also lead to arrests?
Well, I think that I mean, legally, when a national court rules, in relation to crimes or to situations like this, I mean, the powers rest within the nation, right? Or within in this case, Honduras. The international group of experts did release a very scathing report that points fingers directly to different corporations. So here, I mean, there's no direct punishment, but there is a moral condemnation that is associated, and these international actors, banks, corporations in other countries, walk out with all this very well documented evidence in their faces. So they are held accountable to some extent, and this can of course create other processes and networks in the countries where these institutions are based, such as the FMO in the Netherlands, for instance. I mean, people in the Netherlands who read the reports, organizations based here, they could try and sort of bring these actors also to some sort of legal responsibilities. And yeah, it hasn't happened, but what I'm trying to say is that because because we are all connected and these global networks do exist and work, there's always a possibility.
Right. I have it's about the same subject, but it's a different way of phrasing it, maybe. And it's a question from Lucy Smulders, and she asks, it seems to be a problem that goes beyond the responsibility of big companies or the politics getting rid of these people, and instead is more of a racial issue or a racist issue, which also places it in a bigger picture, like you did in your presentation when you talked about the past, the history of the colonization. What does that mean for the kind of solution that we are looking for, if it's a problem of racism?
Sure. And I think that, there's something about it, although we also must say that, in many cases, environmental defenders belong to different groups, right? So different types of society. Sometimes they are even members of the dominant society. People, even activists that work in solidarity and that go from here all the way to some of these countries. So yes, but there's definitely, I guess that the main argument that I try to make is that we still operate on the basis of principles that were established in a different time, right? So with this terra nullius approach that is still present, you can recognize it in some of the arguments that not only hostile organizations at the grassroots level, but also governments and international corporations continue to make. So I think that what we do is to sort of try to understand the complexity of the situation, why environmental protection is so important, not only for people who live in the environment, in the regions that are threatened, close to the resources that are also in peril, but why this has repercussions, has impact the lives of different societies, different peoples in the world. So it's easier said than done, definitely. But I think that it's worth making the effort to understand better, to try to build bridges between different cosmologies, different ways of thinking, to try to understand the complexity that local knowledge offers in understanding the way environments operate, how nature exists, and acknowledge that there's a value in that kind of knowledge, even if it's not knowledge that is produced in universities or in scientific institutions. Mm-hmm. So that's also part of recognizing that sort of restoring the channels of communication, and really making an effort.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about the last point that you're making, that there is knowledge in these indigenous populations that is not per se a part of science, or hasn't been in the past. Because there's a question by Tom van der Stelt, who asked, do you know if conservation scientists have looked at the methods by which indigenous peoples protect and stimulate biodiversity? And if so, whether this could be used at a larger scale? Are they also looking at that?
Sure. I think that more and more these days. In fact, if I think about, so I'm trained. I was trained as an anthropologist, and in anthropology we always had an area that it was called environmental anthropology. It was before it was called. I think it was economic anthropology, but it moved gradually towards environmental anthropology. And that area started to develop in the early years of this century. So it's already 20 years, the field growing. And at the time, 20 years ago, when the field started, it was only anthropologists. And, we are, by training, whether we belong to an indigenous community or not, we anthropologists are trained to to be open to other forms of knowledge, to recognize the value in different forms of society. And when this still started, it was only us, right? Or and not all of the anthropological field, by that matter.
You were the part of your domain was the only domain really interested in this indigenous knowledge.
Well, yes, along with some other scientists, especially in the global south. In Latin America, there was a tradition of what it was called ethnobotany, and there were also agricultural sciences that were interested in some of this knowledge. But the approach was very much instrumental. It was about picking up separate practices and then trying them out, as the question suggested, at the global scale. What it has happened in the last 20 years is that different scholars, different researchers have come to understand that these practices only make sense when they work as part of a system, right? So the system needs to be acknowledged first, and to be understood in terms of cycles, seasonalities, and the social and political organization of the communities that continue these practices and have this collective knowledge. So being aware of that has eventually led to different stakeholders, not only scientists but also policymakers, to take matters in their own hands and then start implementing, for instance, forms of cultural protection of the environment in places like Australia or Canada or the United States and even in Mexico, trying to reclaim some of this knowledge, but together with the communities. So working within a system that maintains this collective forms of knowledge, and but that doesn't exclude other people, right? So on the contrary, because of this, knowledge is being recognized as valid, as empirically founded. It's easier to create bridges with other communities that live today in those same areas, and then teach them about these ways, about how to recognize the seasonality of certain phenomena, how to maintain the equilibrium of certain ecosystems, and so on.
Right. Thanks. I'd like to go a bit into another topic, which is, can you give me an image of what activism means, what activism can mean if you're talking about indigenous earth defenders?
Well, I mean, depending on the situation, activism can take different forms. So, for instance, just looking at the news these days, there's demonstrations, so people actively protesting in public squares or in the places, the very places where some of these projects that are considered damaging to the environment happen. We have images on our news channels, from, for instance, the demonstrations against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, 2017. Many other forms of activism happen on a day-to-day basis, and they consist on the one hand, gathering reports, trying to doing research, especially environmental impact assessments, whether they are made public or not, filing requests to different courts to obtain those documents, making sure that everybody knows about the effects, that are documented in relation to some of these damaging projects, holding public meetings with members of the community to discuss the different issues, what are the perceptions, how people are looking at these projects in terms of sometimes situations of poverty. So, people are actually thirsty for jobs, for opportunities to earn a living. So informing, sharing information, considering the long-term effects is also part of what this activism consists of. Going over to offices, lobbying, spreading the news, writing journalistic pieces, setting up websites, creating maps. In my talk, I speak about the Waorani people in Ecuador. So through a very interesting alliance with digital activists in the United States, they were able to create their own map for their own region, for their own territories, and then they were able to create a website where they put all of this information for other people to know, to inform the public, but also as a resource to go and talk to the different investors and show them, look, I mean, these people are telling you that this land is empty, but here we're showing you that in fact there's more than meets the eye at first instance. Yeah. So all of those are forms of activism.
Yeah, and converge. You mentioned also in your last slide, you mentioned some political or more like NGOs and indigenous organizations that also perform activism, also from countries like the Netherlands, right? What kind of activism can be done in the Netherlands to, I'm quoting Lisa Lot, who asks, what can we do to help? What can be done to help from the Netherlands?
Yeah. So these guys, what they do, I've met some of them, and what they do is that, so they're based in the Netherlands because they're training, in law or in, how to do better research to document some of these situations. They also hold informative meetings, sometimes in universities, sometimes in public squares. I've met a couple of them. I was actually at a demonstration in 2019. There was a demonstration in front of an embassy, the embassy of Brazil, in fact, and these organizations left a letter to the Brazilian ambassador in the Netherlands, protesting for the assassinations of a number of leaders, indigenous leaders in Brazil. And there's also lots of documents that they procure. They can go to offices, banks, and demand to see statements and other official documents that will eventually help people at the grassroots level. So there are different ways in which these organizations and activists can contribute.
Right, and there's one in particular that is called citizen diplomacy that we talked about a bit earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Could you, because I know that in the YouTube chat right now, there is one of the members of this NGO or of this organization, Milton, who's also answering some questions to some of the students or the people watching already. Can you explain a bit what this organization does, citizen diplomacy?
Well, this is an interesting example. I've spoken very briefly to Milton, who is himself a researcher. He moved to the Netherlands a few years back, and what he has been doing is using different sources of information to create a picture, a systematic picture of what is happening in Colombia in the last 10 years. So he's the one who gave me that piece of information that I shared in my talk. And by the way, he also has asked me to correct the record because it was a little bit confused with the numbers. So in fact, in the talk I give different numbers, but so the indigenous population of Colombia amounts to 4.4% of the population. And what he has recorded through his research is that in the last 10 years, there have been several crimes and killings in Colombia of human rights defenders, environmental and political activists. And 40% of those crimes, of those killings, have affected people who live in the countryside. So these are rural populations in general. So this includes Afro-descendants, also the dominant rural population, which is who are not necessarily indigenous. And what he asked me to say is that it's in fact 26% of the killings that have directly affected indigenous peoples, and not 44 like I said in the. So these are the factual numbers. The numbers for Mexico, those still stand.
Yeah.
But in the case of Colombia, the record should be corrected. So this is the kind of activism that they do, and they also offer, they're trying to. They have created alliances with some of the other organizations, like the Shelter Cities project, which offers to host some of these human rights defenders, environmental, also political defenders, in the Netherlands, so that they can take a break from the tension, from the stress, and then also remove them from actual threats, right? So that the perpetrators, the material perpetrators, cannot reach them so easily, right?
Yeah.
So they host them in places like Rotterdam, like Utrecht, like Gouda. I've met a few of these activists during my time in the Netherlands.
Yeah. I want to talk a bit about your career as a scientist. There is a question, and I have to look for who asked it. Caro C, and she asks, I'm interested in the path, Dr. Genner, you have taken, which seems quite unique. You ended up at this point in the Netherlands. Right, so she asks, since when did this topic of Maya anthropology exist in science? How did you connect with it? How did you find it in your career path?
Well, the Maya is, my people is one of the most studied in the world, and the study of Maya archaeology, Maya anthropology dates back to the second half of the 19th century. I mean, not as a science, but the interest was there. And then, Mexico has a very long tradition, and actually quite strong scholarship in relation to indigenous peoples from the early 20th century. In Latin America, Mexican anthropology is one of the most respected, by our other Latin American countries. Early in my life, I decided to study anthropology as a career, and I was also interested in the many applications of this type of knowledge for different forms of social justice and human rights movements. So early in my career, I worked with different NGOs in my home region, in the Yucatan. We were looking into different aspects of Maya grassroots culture. We looked into spirituality, ceremonial traditions, cosmological principles, and so on, to understand the dynamism of these ideas. We also work on agricultural activities, promoted ecological agriculture and also apiculture, which didn't damage the environment. We promoted indigenous rights, women's rights also in indigenous communities, and so on. So that was very early in my life, and eventually this led me to later pursue postgraduate degrees and move to the UK for a master's, and then eventually did my PhD in the UK as well. And I've been working in collaboration with different indigenous communities and organizations ever since. And that's I'm in a way I'm lucky that this has become my my way of earning a living, and I was happy to contribute to creating bridges and amplifying the voices of people who are um, fighting the good fight.
Yeah, yeah, and you've done so again tonight and this morning, amplifying these voices. I'm like, maybe it's a too personal question, but where you were talking about the cosmological principles of indigenous peoples, how do you yourself see nature?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because, yeah, I mean, I have this double or maybe triple identity. One as an indigenous person, as a Maya person, two as an anthropologist, and three as an NGO person, right? Because I grew up working side by side with people who were looking for ways of creating alternatives to different things. So yeah, for me, I mean, I can being in the forest whenever I go back to my home region, it's always something that I treasure. Walking on the ancient cities of my ancestors, discovering new details every time. That's an experience that I cannot translate just simply by saying, "Oh, this is an intellectual journey," or it is a spiritual experience. I think it's both. I cannot separate that, but it's quite. It connects me every time to the land, to my land, to the land of my ancestors. Funnily enough, I never really. I mean, everywhere I go, I also try to pay attention to what is happening with my surroundings. I don't think that. I mean, people often, oh, it's because you're an indigenous person, right? So you're always paying attention to nature. I don't think it's that. I think it also comes from training. It also comes from what I learned to do, and observe people in their environment. So I think it's also part of being an anthropologist. But it goes all together.
Yeah,
you cannot separate it.
It's part of being you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and is there a moment when you were studying in the UK or living in the Netherlands that you got out of touch with that kind of status, that kind of point of view?
Yeah, I mean, life is so dynamic, and sometimes you feel a little bit, separated from your country, and then you go back, and it clicks almost immediately. I mean, I remember living in the UK. So my home region is extremely hot and humid. It's a little bit like the Netherlands, but at 40 degrees 60% of the time, right? So it's when the temperature drops to 15 degrees, then all of the Yucatecans pull out their sweaters and put them on. So living in both in the UK and the Netherlands is quite, it takes a lot of adaptation. And after many years living in the UK, I was due to go back for some research to the Yucatan in the middle of the hottest days of the year, and I was dreading really going back, fearing that my body wasn't going to respond the way it used to when I was younger, and what I realized is that my body remembered, quite surprisingly. I mean, my body found a way of readapting because that's the way I grew up. So yes, I mean, you get disconnected necessarily because in order to adapt to these conditions, your body needs to change, and it has changed. So now I'm able to stand cold weather as well as extremely hot weather.
Right. Yeah. The question that is kind of associated with it. Sometimes we realize, and I know that many students who study the environment sometimes also realize, it's sometimes hard to not give into despair, because the situations can be so dire, and to look at the future doesn't make things better sometimes. How do you take care that you do not fall into despair?
It's a perfectly interesting question. I think that so actually after I was with you in the morning in Utrecht, I came back and I was watching. There's a Canadian Indigenous scholar that I follow online, and I was listening to her talking about every single day that we are still here is a victory won against the forces that have tried to assimilate us or displace us or um, um, erase our ways of life. Every time we speak our language, that's an action that reaffirms that we are still here. So this is when it comes to indigenous experiences. I think this, it rings true. It touches really close to home, and I think that every time we going back to the question about environmental activism, every time that we manage to preserve, patch of forest, that we keep our rivers clean, that we prevent glaciers from melting permanently, and so on. That's also a victory won. We are actually stopping a process that seems inevitable, but the more we struggle and strive to stop it, and every time we do manage to detain that process, or that's a reason to celebrate. Mm-hmm. So I would like us to keep our eyes in the long-term future and in the goals, but also to enjoy those small victories that we are totally able to get even more if we work together.
Yeah, right. Thanks for these beautiful words. I want to finish off with these words and say to everybody in the public that I've seen many of your questions, and unfortunately we haven't had time to cover all of these questions. But I try to capture the spirit of what you've been asking and discussed it with Hener. I know that Milton might still be around in the YouTube chat if you still want to ask him any questions. And for now, thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back next week where Herman Lelyveld will be talking about agriculture. All right, have a good evening. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you very much for listening and for engaging.